other people pulling that information in, other people thinking about what they can do with it. That's how knowledge is created. That's how knowledge is disseminated. So the clarity is the cornerstone of readability. Well, I'll look at that in a slightly different way than you might expect. We're not looking at grammatical clarity this time. We're looking at kind of structural clarity. And part of that will be differentiating descriptions of design and descriptions of methodology. Now this is something that you might, study design or research design and methodology. This is something that you might think is kind of self-evident, and it often is. But I found over the years, 17 years of doing this, that even fairly highly ranked academics have this tendency to slip into the problem of not quite differentiating design and methodology. And as I have found talking to others and reading through the literature, it's actually a really common problem in journals as well. So in a sense, it's not something that will necessarily get noticed, but remember the focus is on getting the readers to noticed by the journal itself, but remember the focus should be on getting your readers to notice. And why not all methodological details are important will be the second aspect of that focus on clarity. Or to put it in a slightly different way, why not all details given in the methodology section are actually methodology. Once again, this might seem obvious to you, but it's an easy thing to fall into, and it's an easy thing to pick up, and reviewers do pick up this sort of thing. Thesis examiners pick it up all the time. Reviewers of journal articles constantly pick it up. We do see a lot of journal reviews because we often come in at the second stage of a paper submission, where someone has submitted the paper, they've asked, the journalist asked them to edit it, and we see the replies to the reviewers as well as the journal article, and of course the reviewer reports. And I'll quickly preview webinar 5. To give a preview of that preview, it will be towards the end of next month rather than in the middle this time around, just to help us overcome some an admin situation here. Okay, so what is clarity? The broadest description of clarity, at the fundamental level, is it makes things easy to understand. It makes things easy to follow. When someone is clear, you can understand them straight away. But there's a fair bit more detail to it, and I'll just quickly go through that. Clarity really is a state of refined communication. Most people aren't clear, certainly in writing, most people aren't clear immediately. That's why we have these things called drafts, and also people called editors as well. But it's for almost all people who write, clarity is not natural. Clarity is something that has to be worked on. Writing has a logic of its own, and it can take us off on a side note. When we write something, the thinking process, the creative process in writing often sends us to the end of the sentence in a different way than we thought we might have, and that's when lack of clarity comes in. So it's a state of refined communication. We have to work on it. It doesn't mean simple. For instance, if you're writing for a highly specialized audience, it's never going to be simple, the writing you're doing, but it can be clear to people who understand the terminology and the concepts. So it doesn't need to be simple, but it does need to be easily understood. As I said before, the focus of clarity is making sure it's easily understood. That can vary from a very small audience to a very large audience, depending on who you are. I talked about people like Richard Dawkins last time, who write for a really broad audience audiences about evolution in his case, or John Gribben, who writes about quantum theory, quantum mechanics. Extremely complex concepts, but they're very, very good writers and can get those messages across. Not everyone's like that. Not everyone wants to be like that. So at any level you're working at, it must be easily understood for your target audience. So in fact, there's a point in that itself. Always know your target audience, and that will help you be clear in the best possible way. Always use the fewest words possible. This doesn't mean just breaking things down to simple, once again, simple sentences, but it does mean that if you've got really long sentences, if you've got really long paragraphs, be suspicious of your own writing process. Ask yourself, is that clear? But and make sure it can't be misinterpreted. Everyone will misinterpret. I'm sure everyone here has had this experience of a reviewer at a review. That just went off by itself. Excuse me. You've had journal reviewers misunderstand what you've said, and we see this a lot with people having to explain to the reviewers that no, that wasn't the case. What I said was this, and you've probably had thesis examiners or thesis supervisors, or supervisory panel people misunderstanding. Well, that's all a part of the negotiation process of generating knowledge and getting it through. But limiting the misinterpretation is a key responsibility of the author, because it allows your readers to see your point. Now, clarity and readability. Let's narrow the focus down a little bit. Clarity makes writing easier to read, as I've said, but it makes it easier to read because it defines the writer's scope. It says what you are doing and implies what you are not doing, or sometimes it actually deliberately says what you're not doing. It creates reader expectations. In terms of methodology, when you have a clearly described methodology, it allows your reader to understand whether A, your methodology is sound, and B, whether it's probably replicable. And there's a huge problem, as I said before, with replicability in some fields. It delivers information efficiently. But clarity is a little bit more than it seems, and I want to focus on two elements of clarity in relation to methodology writing or methodological descriptions that you might not quite have thought about before. And as I said, I'm not going to be looking at grammar, going to be looking at structure, and in a sense paragraph structure, sentence structure, just to show the kind of more subtle ways in which things become unclear. You might recall from last time I talked about, when we were talking about paragraph writing, I talked about the structure of the paper, or the kind of compulsory sections of a paper: introduction, literature review, and so forth, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion. That's just an example in one field. That works like a framework of a building. And the paragraphs are like the elevator going up the building to get the reader to the conclusions at the top. Okay, once again, we're looking at kind of that sort of process. It's clarity is driving a reader towards where you want him to be. And there's also a spelling mistake there, and if you picked it, you get the bonus prize. I don't know what the bonus prize is yet, but I'll think about it later. Clarity is about priority. Okay, there's a saying in English, first things first, or in other words, making sure that the most important thing is mentioned first, making sure that the part that logically should proceed does precede the main part. Okay, that all sounds very abstract. Let's consider what I mean through this description. Now, this is a description of methodology from a paper, a recent paper. This was written by a professor, so it's not a new author. It's what I'm going to say is not a criticism of the overall paper. It's just looking at the way the research design and the research, the methodology used is conflated. Let me just use my highlighter here. So we have here the data were collected from 207 workers, all of whom are college graduates. That doesn't really matter structurally at the moment. With the help of the career office of a university, alumni were contacted, data were collected. See, you have these action words: were contacted, were collected. These are verbs, okay? That's a method that says what was done. And invited, there's another verb there. 4 waves of the survey, well, that's a noun, but you know that there is a method, a part of a methodology. And here, were conducted over a 12-month period in 4-month intervals. let's just not worry about that end of the minute. But over a 12-month period. So what we have in a section of the methodology description on research design, we get all the way to the bottom before possibly we're talking about the research design. This information here is actually methodology. Now just quickly, I just want to mention one point here, method and methodology. I'm aware that methodology is a collection of methods. Many journals use this method as a subheading, and I am just repeating what the journal has here. The ellipses at the here is just describing why this method was justified by something that had already taken place within the literature. But you can see from all my squiggles and my marks there that there is something basically problematic here. There's something basically gone wrong. Now, if you look at it once again, data were collected. Okay, so that's really part of methodology, as I said. Why does that go right under research design? Let's see what we can do about this. We need to establish the priority. Remember, the research design, as you know, is the logic of your research. It is the way about which you've approached it. It might be quantitative, it might be qualitative, it might be a longitudinal study, it might be a, which you're kind of guessing this is probably the case now, it might be a cross-sectional study. The methods that you could use a survey in every single one of those research designs. So what's happened is there's been a kind of a confusion between a survey as a method and the research design as a whole. So let's separate the implied design and methodology. So I've done away with the research design subheading, and then I've just focused on, once again with the pen here, over a 12-month period. Now that is at least an implied design. It suggests it could be longitudinal. It is, but some people would argue that not so much, because 12 months is not really a longitudinal study. It would have to be much longer. And then this is all method. Okay, over a 12-month period, 4 waves of a survey were used to collect data from 207 workers. Then it goes on to describe the way in which those workers were recruited. Okay, so the problem really is here when the person is thinking about the recruitment of the people as part of the research design, but the design hasn't really been stated in any case. So the methodology and the design are getting all mixed up. Let me wipe out those marks, and to just make the point, now design logically precedes methodology. Okay, it needs to come first. It can't come at the implied design can't come at the end of the paragraph. So the first takeaway for today is really simple. Write about design before methodology. If you're going to mix them up together, at least write about the implied design first. You know, like, okay, it's a particular period of study, and that will suggest to the reader that you are using a certain approach to your research. So you create the framework, then you build the description, rather than building description and then creating the framework. So that's one point, establishing priority. The second point is about focus, ensuring focus all the time, ensuring relevance all the time. Description of methodology, as I said when I started, should only describe methods, or describe the community of methods that create your methodology. Let's consider this one. This is a great one because it's so descriptive. The samples were soaked in linseed oil for 4 hours, turning purple and developing a distinct smell of cabbage. You can kind of almost get that smell there just by reading that. But the problem is this is a methodology section. Okay, so these parts here, well, descriptive, okay, they're descriptive, but they are not methodology. They are results, okay? And you might think, oh, I would never do that. It's obvious that they're results. Yes, it is obvious, but also, yes, people do it quite often. And it's an easy thing to do because you're thinking about the whole process. You're not just thinking about, okay, let's subdivide this off into discrete areas. So the correct way to write it would be the samples were soaked in linseed oil for 4 hours. And you can notice one really important thing about that sentence rather, it's short. Okay, it's short, it's clear, there's no way of misinterpreting that. When you're writing about methodology and the paragraphs start to get too long or the sentences start to get too convoluted, have a look at it and see what part of that isn't really about methodology. Because when it's convoluted, it probably isn't. And if it remains convoluted, it might well be that your methodology is very difficult to describe and you're going to have to start breaking it down to smaller sections. Okay, here's a second one. Now this is a bit more common, this sort of thing, because there is, some people find it difficult to distinguish two parts of this sentence. During image stretching, some resolution was lost, possibly interfering with counts of craters less than 5 kilometers in diameter. Now, this one here is really easy to do because it's an explanation of that, okay? It does, in fact, logically belong in this sentence, but once again, only if you don't have to have methodology and a discussion section. So the methodology is during image stretching, some resolution was lost. Okay, that's a description of what happened when the project was underway. The rest is basically an inference. It's something that belongs in the discussion section. But as I said, it's very easy to do this because it's so tempting to say why there was a limitation in the methodology when writing about the methodology. But we can't do that, can we? We need to move on. So, keeping to the point, and it's critical to credibility. In other words, thinking back to what I said before, a person will look at your method, decide whether it's a credible method and whether it can be replicated. It has to be credible to be replicated, obviously. But it shows that you know the distinction between method. Not only that, about in writing terms, it also shows that you know you are focused on making a credible method. Now, just to cover the takeaway from this is really simple. Stay on target when describing methodology. It's so easy to veer off, and we see that quite a bit. So your readers aren't distracted, and your readers can't be distracted as I've said, because it builds your credibility. But if your readers are distracted and they're reading a paper, you're not likely to get many readers to start with. They'll probably look at the methodology, as a lot of people do. They'll quickly look at the abstract, the methodology, look at the conclusions. If they get to the methodology before reading the whole paper, see that it's just not credible, they're gone. Reviewers will be extremely harsh, and publishing will be a lot more difficult than it could be, just for the sake of making sure that everything's on point. So quickly, before we finish, there's my little man to remind you, clarity is the key to readability. Design does not equal methodology, although it's obvious. It sometimes creeps in and the confusion starts to kind of mount up. Give details that are needed, not details that aren't. There's also a corollary to that. If you are describing something in methodology, and this is strictly not in our scope as copy editors, but if you're describing something in methodology that's long and tedious and really, 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 really boring, consider a figure if you can, because that will convey the same amount of information effectively. Give details that are needed, and try not to give too many details. Your reader should always be on your mind. You always should be thinking about your readers. Writing is for readers, not for writers. Okay, and it's easy to think about writing being for writers when it's your job, it's your living, it's your vocation, it's your avocation even, and you're focusing on that all the time, but there are people who need to read your work, and that's really critically important. So, as I said before, that's wrapping up for this week. Next time around, we will be holding the webinar on the 30th of August. That's the second, I think, last day of August. We will be focusing on uncommon summarization skills. I call them uncommon because people summarize relatively, not basically, I should say, that people tend to repeat what they're writing when they summarize. It's very common to see exactly repeated phrases throughout an abstract, an introduction, sometimes a conclusion. We're swapping towards the end of the paper now, looking at discussions and conclusions, and we'll be focusing on why summarization matters, why good summarization matters, how to learn to paraphrase, which is basically stripping sentences and paragraphs down to their bare essentials without ruining the meaning or clouding the meaning. Foreshadowing and reviewing, in other words, saying what will happen in the later part of the paper and what has happened in the previous part of the paper. And as I said, it's a longer gap this time. It's around about 6 weeks' time. So if anyone has any questions, just ask me now, or whatever you like. It could even be about the previous webinars. I'll just wait for a couple of quick minutes to see what happens. One of the things I want to suggest, and I really should mention this every single time, and I'm going to repeat what I've already said, and it is a good thing, believe me. Readers are critical to your success. Okay, everything you do in research is a part of a knowledge community, and of course you know that. But what some people forget is that writing skills are one of the major ways in which that knowledge community is built. And as I said at the beginning, writing isn't something that happens easily. Most people have to struggle with it, or they at least have to work on it and develop it. So if we always keep in mind that readers are the focus rather than the research is the focus, rather than I am the focus, rather than my field is the focus, just keep that kind of basic concept in mind. It will always push you towards being clear and being a much more effective writer. Okay, so no questions. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along again, and we'll see you all.